long-standing official U.S. position on the very critical matter of the status of Jerusalem. It declared the annexation of Jerusalem legitimate at the UN General Assembly. That unilaterally reverses Security Council resolutions going back to right after the occupation, resolutions that the U.S. had supported, at least in words. And it also eliminated any possibility, any residual possibility of a peaceful negotiated settlement if the vote's taken seriously. Shortly after George Bush declared the arch-terrorist Sharon a man of peace during his further depredations in the territories, and demanded that Arafat, who was no longer fulfilling his assigned role of controlling the population, has to be replaced by a prime minister who would be expected to follow U.S.-Israeli demands, and they selected Mahmoud Abbas, although, as the Times put it, unlike Mr. Arafat, he does not have a popular following. That provides further illustration of the president's vision of democracy. Bush later announced the messianic vision to bring democracy to the Middle East, simultaneously endorsing the imprisonment of the one elected leader in the Arab world in his compound in Ramallah by the man of peace. All of this passes without any qualms. Let's go back to the New York Times story on the death of Arafat. I'm, as I suppose is obvious, selecting the New York Times only because of its overwhelming importance. The rest were similar. The story begins by saying that the first paragraph, the post-Arafat era will be the latest test of a quintessentially American article of faith, that elections provide legitimacy even to the frailest institutions. That's the first paragraph. You read the long story, you get to the continuation page, and you get to the last paragraph, and the last paragraph says, the paradox for the Palestinians is rich. In the past, the Bush administration resisted new national elections among the Palestinians because it thought that Arafat would win. Okay, that tells you what the quintessential American faith is. And it's not American, it's British and French and all the way back. Elections are just fine as long as they come out the right way, just as in the past, and it has the same paradoxical quality that runs all through history. If our deeds consistently conflict with our words, that's a paradox. And you have to have profound explanations of what causes it. It's easy to explain when we're referring to Stalin or Saddam Hussein or some other leader, but it's extremely paradoxical when it consistently and systematically reflects our own behavior. One of the reasons for graduate courses in international relations and things like this, to explain these things. But we're pretending to take it seriously, so let's continue. The front page of the New York Times also had a sort of a think piece, inquiry into the background, and it opens by saying that Arafat was both the symbol of the Palestinians' hope for a viable independent state and the prime obstacle to its realization. He was never able to reach the heights of President Anwar Sadat of Egypt, who won back the Sinai through a peace treaty with Israel because he was able to reach out to Israelis and address their hopes and fears, unlike Arafat. Well, that reveals the joys of owning history. You can therefore forget about the facts, which are very deep in the memory hole, but they're well documented and uncontroversial. In 1971, President Sadat of Egypt offered a full peace treaty to Israel, right in accord with official U.S. policy. namely full peace, in return for Israeli withdrawal from Egyptian territory. Incidentally, there was nothing mentioned there about the Palestinians. This is before the Palestinian issue had sort of arisen on the international agenda. Israel recognized that it was what they called a genuine peace offer, considered it, decided to reject it, and the reasons were simple. They preferred expansion to security. Peace would have meant the end of the interstate conflict with Egypt out of it. Jordan came along with a similar proposal shortly after. So they could have had full peace, integration into the region, nothing about the Palestinians, but they preferred expansion. This is the Labor government, incidentally, Golda Meir's Labor government. The big project at that time was expansion into the northeastern Sinai, where thousands of farmers had been forcefully expelled, kicked into the desert, villages, mosques, everything destroyed, preparing for the building of an all-Jewish city, the city of Yamit. And again, that means with U.S. backing, otherwise it doesn't take place. So they decided to reject the peace offer. The serious question was what would happen in Washington. The Egyptian offer was right in accord with official U.S. policy. There was debate in Washington. It was won by Henry Kissinger, whose position, as he put it, was stalemate. No negotiations, only force. Okay, that won out, so the U.S. shifted its position, supported Israeli expansion over security. That was the background for the 1973 war. Sadat kept saying, if you want to accept a negotiated peace, we'll have to go to war. He was simply dismissed with ridicule. It was a very racist period in the U.S. and Israel. Arabs don't know how to hold guns and disregard them and so on. The 73 war came along, and it was a big surprise. It was a very close thing for Israel. It led to a nuclear alert. It could have caused a nuclear war. At that point, Kissinger realized Egypt can't simply be dismissed as a basket case, and he moved to the second position, shuttle diplomacy. I won't go through the details, but it ended up at Camp David in 1978-79, when the U.S. and Israel reluctantly accepted Sadat's 1971 proposal, which is pretty much what happened. The way that comes down in history is it's an enormous diplomatic triumph for the United States. President Carter won the Nobel Prize. We're terribly proud of ourselves. Sadat had become a man of peace by reiterating the offer that we rejected in 1971. In fact, it was a diplomatic catastrophe. The U.S.-Israeli refusal to accept the offer led to a terrible war with possibly very grim consequences, bad enough as it was, and then years of violence and repression, and finally the United States and Israel accepted the agreement, and it comes down in history the way I described. That's Arafat's inability to reach the heights of Sadat. Then it goes on, I quoted, to say that Arafat was the prime obstacle to the realization of a Palestinian state. How did he do that? Well, perhaps that refers to 1976, when the first Security Council resolution was proposed by the Arab states to call for a two-state settlement, including UN 242, the basic document which guarantees Israel all the rights of any state in the region, peace and security, and so on, but also including a Palestinian state in the occupied territories. That was vetoed by the United States, so therefore it's out of history automatically. It was supported by the PLO. I won't go through the rest of the history. It runs the same way right to the present, year by year. But it's out of history, even though it's in history. The position that the U.S. vetoed in 1976, supported by almost everyone, continues to be supported not only by the international opinion, but also, and this isn't well known, and it's important, by the majority of the American public. Large majority of the American public supports this solution. In fact, they support what's called now the Saudi plan, which was accepted by the Arab states a couple of years ago, which calls for full peace, full normalization in return for Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories. That was just reiterated by the Arab foreign ministers a few days ago, virtually unreported. That's supported by a large majority of the population, but interestingly, that same large majority urges the United States to become more involved in the peace process, because they are unaware that the United States is the prime reason why this proposal cannot be implemented, and has been for 30 years. Well, that's a triumph of propaganda. The population hasn't a clue what policy is, and you can't find it out unless you carry out a kind of an individual research project, or you're a member of an activist organization. Actually, popular attitudes in the United States towards this are extremely interesting. Right now, the proportion of the American population that says that the U.S. should support Israel rather than the Palestinians is 17%, 1-7. If you look in more detail at detailed polls, which can't be reported, a large majority of the population thinks that the U.S. ought to cut off all aid to either of the two sides, Israel or the Palestinians, that is not negotiating in good faith to achieve this settlement. That would mean cutting off all aid to Israel. And if both sides are negotiating in good faith, same majority says the U.S. ought to equalize aid to them, which is so remote from policy and discussion that you can't even mention it. So naturally, none of this ever gets reported, although it's done by the most respected academic polling institutions in the country. Well, that's of some importance. All of this continues right through the 1990s, right through the Oslo period, alongside of U.S.-Israeli expansion into the territories. The U.S. and Israel refused completely to consider the possibility of a Palestinian state. Shimon Peres was particularly explicit about this. The goals of the Israeli doves were described in 1998 by Shlomo Ben Ami. He was soon to become Barak's chief negotiator at Camp David. This is in Hebrew. He wrote in an academic work that the goals of the Israeli doves, he said that the Oslo peace process was intended to lead to a permanent neo-colonial dependency for the Palestinians in the occupied territories with some form of local autonomy. The Israeli settlement and integration of the territories proceeded with full support, peaking, as I mentioned, in 2000. Finally, in 2003, Bush received his vision of a Palestinian state somewhere, maybe in Saudi Arabia somewhere, or Mars. It wasn't very clear about it. There's a journalistic convention, which I notice is followed in England as well, and that is when you mention George Bush, you have to add the word vision. Anything he says is not just a statement, but it's a vision. You'll sometimes seen it a dozen times in an article. So he had a vision of a two-state settlement, and now the journalistic convention is that whenever we speak about someday in the future, two states somewhere, we have to say that we're dedicating ourselves to bring about the Bush's vision. I think Kim Jong-il could hardly have asked for more. There was an obituary in the New York Times by Judith Miller, their leading specialist on the Middle East, keeps entirely to the official, of Arafat, keeps to the official history. I'll disregard it, except the last point. She finally reaches the year 2000, gives the standard story. Arafat walked away from, this is all quotes, walked away from the magnanimous Clinton-Barak offer of peace. He later refused to join Barak in accepting Clinton's December 2002 parameters, which proves conclusively that he insists on violence, depressing truth, which the peace-loving states, the United States and Israel, must somehow come to terms with. Well, there's, as usual, an actual history.